So here we have a neuron. When we're talking about neurons, there's four major particles and proteins that we're going to talk about. Outside of the neuron, there is a lot of sodium, which is positively charged, and there's also a lot of chlorine, and that's negatively charged. Inside the neuron, we have a lot of potassium, which is positively charged, as well as a lot of proteins, and those are negatively charged. Overall, the inside of the neuron is negatively charged in comparison to the outside. Now, when it comes to these particles and proteins, they really like moving a lot. However, they have some issues in the social world. Now, let's say we have a lot of one type of particle, and we have this guy here. He's Tommy. Now, Tommy doesn't like to be with so many friends because, well, he's kind of introverted. So he's going to want to leave to an area where there's less people, or particles in this case. And there's another thing. Let's say Tommy is, he's in a positive mood, right? But there's a lot of positivity around him. And so for him to keep his sanity, he needs just a little bit of pessimism. So Tommy's gonna wanna go to a place where there's more negative charge. So when we're looking at sodium and chlorine and potassium and the proteins, they're all charged either negatively or positively, and all in concentrations where there's more of them. In terms of protein, it's negatively charged, so it wants to find a positive charge, making it want to leave. There's also a lot of those proteins in the cell, which makes it want to leave as well. However, the cell membrane does not allow that movement. In that case, it cannot leave. Next, we'll go on to potassium. There's a lot of potassium inside the cell, which makes it want to leave. However, it's more positively charged outside of the cell, and for that reason, potassium wants to stay in. And for that reason, there's no movement. And now, when we go to chlorine, there's a lot of chlorine outside, which makes it want to go inside. However, inside is negatively charged like the chlorine, and that makes the chlorine want to stay outside. So there's still no movement. And finally, we get to sodium, and sodium is the oddball. Because sodium wants to go into the cell, because there's a lot of it outside, but it's also negative inside, which is the opposite of sodium's positive charge. So all the forces acting on sodium want to go into the neuron. Finally, a guy who can move. And that's why when we open the sodium channels in the cell, sodium wants to rush in. All of those guys want a part in the neuron. So here we have a graph of a neuron with its charge in millivolts over time. And we're going to start at the resting potential of negative 70 millivolts. At the end, we'll get to around plus 50 millivolts, about halfway through actually, but we'll get to that later. So as you remember, we have these sodium ions that are coming into the cell, and they slowly increase in number until we hit this point right here. And that's called the threshold of excitation. At this point, the sodium channels are open and many sodium rush into the neuron, causing the charge of the cell to become more positive very quickly. Somewhere along this line, we have potassium start to leave the cell, but the potassium is leaving slower than the sodium, so the charge of the cell continues to become more positive. And this process is called depolarization, as it's going away from its very negative charge and actually gets to a positive charge. At the very top here, where we're at the maximum charge of usually around plus 50 millivolts, we have the sodium stop coming into the cell because the ion channels are closed. And then we get into what is called repolarization, where now all we have is the potassium leaving the cell, and now the cell is getting more negatively charged, and it actually goes below the negative 70 that it started at. Then this is called hyperpolarization. Eventually, the cell reaches its resting potential of negative 70 millivolts once again. In this period of hyperpolarization, there's a refractory period, which simply means that the cell cannot have another action potential right away. And this all starts in what is called the axon hillock, which is the very beginning of the axon.